Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you to our webinar today. We're excited to have Jenny Hollingsworth and John Grant from Innovia Consulting joining us as they continue their manufacturing series. Today's session is Confidently Forecast Sales and Production. But before we pass it over to John and Jenny, I'd like to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be posted to our on-demand webinar library, so you can review it and share it with anyone who you like. And if you have any questions along the way, feel free to type them into the question box and we'll make sure that they get answered. So with all that out of the way, I'm going to pass it over to Jenny and John to kick off our presentation.
All right. So we're going to talk about confidently forecasting sales and production. That's our topic for today. My name is Jenny Hollingsworth. If you don't know me, I'm a senior application consultant for Innovia Consulting. I've been here about 15 years, and I've worked at another partner for about 10 years prior to that. So all in all, I've been working with NAV and now BC for about 25 years. And I'll let John introduce himself.
Hi, I'm John Grant at Innovia, obviously a senior consultant also. I've been working with the product / at Innovia for I think 11, 12 years, something like that, losing track. I've also worked in the manufacturing supply chain arena. I've worked on several other products too. And our topic today is of interest. How does BC / NAV, what do customers use in the forecasting arena? So that's what we're going to go through and hopefully give you some tips or what customers are doing today.
All right. Okay, so for our agenda, we're going to go over demand forecasting, an overview, maybe why you'd use it, where it's used in NAV or BC, and the types of forecasts available. One thing I do want to note, it was a question that was sent in advance. Demand forecasting works the same whether you're in NAV or you're in Business Central. They did change the name of it. In NAV, it's called production forecast. In BC, it's now called demand forecasts. Otherwise, the functionality is the same between the two. And then we'll also go through how to create a sales forecast versus creating a production forecast. All right, John,
Okay.
so why would we use demand forecasting?
Yeah, just from a big picture is how we see customers using forecasting in BC. And obviously it's to primarily to help purchasing, but it also can be used for production. And the thought is, number one is if you do get forecasts from your customers to help with your purchasing material and scheduling. Now that's not every customer in our customer base. We have a few that do get forecasts from certain customers, but overall, that's not supplied, and we don't see that a lot where that your customers are sending in forecasts to load into BC forecasting. And of course, if the other part two, that would be, well, let's have sales tell us what the forecast is. And believe it or not, that I have found is probably the last group that will commit to putting a forecast into the system. It's difficult to get sales to commit to a solid forecast, so that may or may not happen. The other reason you might use forecasting in BC is for long lead time purchased items. In other words, if you wait till you get an order for that item or need to consume that item, you're outside the window. Maybe the lead time is 90 days. Might be a casting or something that you need. So you can use forecasting, both sales and component forecasting, which we'll go through, to allow you to, from a planning side, create a forecast and run your planning worksheet or requisition worksheet if it's just purchased items out, look ahead like 90 days. And if that forecast is in that range, it will pull it in and It's just a suggestion. It's not that it's ordering it for you, but it gives you a heads up that, oh yeah, I got this longer lead time item that we're possibly below the reorder point, or we're using lot for lot, or those kind of parameters help you determine, do I order or not? We've also seen it used. We had a customer that, or have a customer that they make food products, and they ordered sugar. It seemed like every day. It was probably twice a week. A certain container they had at home, so much room to store it. So they set up a component forecast for that sugar that was like every other day, or I think it was once a week. They had that number coming in, regardless of the demand, actual demand, the dependent forecast or independent forecast demand. So that allowed purchasing to have this consistent PO that they would order from the vendor, and they sourced it from different vendors, so they couldn't use the purchasing now has you can set up that, oh, these are the 10 items we ordered from this vendor, reoccurring purchase order. That wouldn't cut it because they needed to have it show up in the planning worksheet. And what else? Seasonal, obviously, that's the tough one. You have a seasonal business, so you're ramping up on possible finished product or that you're putting together or need to get in-house to do something to, and you can set that up in the forecast to create this demand, even though you don't have sales orders coming in for 2 months. We worked with a company that they ramped up their finished goods in preparation of their busy season. And then some of the things to think about when you're trying to develop this forecast, you don't have to do every item. It can be overwhelming. Maybe it's just your A items with some B items, the ones that are expensive, or the C items, possibly those if you're have too much in inventory, it's not a big deal. But the A and B items, you don't want to carry extra inventory, but your forecast can help with that. Or those items are set up and you, so if you're wanting to just understand how forecasting might help the planner, pick some of those items that make sense. And like I mentioned, you don't have to do everything. So there's a lot of different, across the customers we worked with, a lot of different approaches. There are add-on products that try and help you determine your forecast. A great example of that is you're distributed with thousands of items, and you're trying to figure out a forecast that can be overwhelming. You possibly might need a add-on, but I encourage you to work in a test company and understand what BC provides to you. And then when you bring in a vendor to look at an option, you've got, I'll say, better questions, because you've kind of worked with it, you kind of know the gaps, and we'll talk about some of those, and you'll get a chance to, the question would be that much better when you bring in a third party to maybe help with the forecast. And some of interest is if you have a company that they had like a recipe, and obviously the finished product is what the sales order, that's in your, you could go look at what did we sell last year at this time. But the interesting part is your bill of material may have changed from what you did a year ago. So when you quote unquote explode the components, it has to be the current bill of material, I'd argue, versus the bill of material for components that was done a year ago in some businesses. That's not reliable. And then you also have to blend in there new products where you're just getting them off the floor. You don't really have sales history if you're trying to build a forecast for your 20% of your items that bring in 80% of the revenue. So those kind of things are all part of the process, and we've had customers all different levels helping, what makes sense to, how do you start? So just wanted to when do we use it? How do we use it? And each customer is a little bit different, but and we'll go through how BC, how you set it up, and how you use it.
So where is demand forecasting used? It's used in two different places, depending if you're using the planning worksheet, creating production orders and purchase orders, or if you're using the requisition worksheet for just purchasing. It's available in both instances. It's on the calculate plan function. And you'll see on the options tab here that there's a use forecast option, and it allows you to drill down and select from any of your demand forecasts that you have created. It also allows you to exclude the forecast before a certain date as well, if you want to exclude entries before the current month, for example. So those are the two places where demand forecasts can be used.
And I'll just add to that a little bit. In the the setup for manufacturing is I think that's available even if you don't have manufacturing. You can put your default forecast in there, so when this screen pops up, it's populated already. And just to add a little more on the exclude forecast before, typically, best practices, like if I'm running a forecast for today, going forward like 6 weeks, I would not include this week in my forecast. As an example, I'd want, starting next Monday forward, that would be sufficient, because it's already, it's already Wednesday, and I don't want to include that forecast for this week in my analysis. As an example, how to use that.
Okay, so John, what types of demand forecasts are there? There's two, the sales forecast and the production forecast, but what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, and you'll hear the term independent demand, and that is a term that means sales orders, transfer orders, things that you don't have control over. It's a sales order that comes in, and then you hear the term dependent demand. And obviously, if it's a kit or a bill of material, the components are dependent on somebody ordering that product or a demand coming from planning. So those two terms are part of it. But you would use a sales forecast. Obviously, if you had a sales forecast from a customer, you could load that in, and we'll show you there's the location and on the items you want to forecast, because that is an independent demand that you know about. I mean, it's coming in from the customer. We have some that they do get it. Like I said, not a lot, but they do get that. That would be considered your sales, and that could come from your sales team too. And maybe it's only your A items or your B items. When you start working with, if you need to approach sales about information, a lot of times if you don't do every item, is that good to know just your A and B items in your demand on the sales, and that production orders, that if you use production orders for planning, and why would you do that? Well, you might have seasonal business, and I'm going to ramp up, their wonderful Cronus Test Company on blue bicycles in January, or let's say starting probably in like November or for the spring. So I could put in the forecast that finished bicycle as in the sales forecast also, on top of any real sales forecast. And then the second part of that forecasting has got a component forecast, which is really, in my example, talked about the sugar. So this company needed a container full of sugar, or it could be milk or whatever they needed for their product, and they knew they ordered that every week. You could put that in your component. The other use for the component is if you have some long lead time items that are purchased, you can set them in the component forecast. And when you run planning, you can choose to run just, they call it MPS or MRP or both. MPS is your, more or less your finished items, your top level items, without the components coming with it. So you could take a look at that. You could run MRP separate, which would, some companies do. They'll run MPS one night into the planning worksheet along with real orders, create their production orders, create their kits, whatever they're doing, and then the next night run MRP, which includes all the components of those items to come up with what do we need to purchase or get transferred in here, or maybe there's sub-assemblies to make inside of that also. So 2 sections to forecasting. The top level is your sales orders. You're trying to forecast your independent demand. And then the component side is typically purchased items that you want to get a regular rhythm to when you're buying it, or long lead time items that you want to control in a planning worksheet versus offline. Now, if you purchase it once a year or twice a year, do you really need to put that in planning? I would say maybe not, but if you purchase it every 90 days, that's the lead time, then you have to have some mechanism to pull in that data to give you a heads up that we're running low on this item. Yes, I don't have any sales orders for it to use it or production using it, but I'm running low, where planning would kick that out and say, hey, based on everything we know, we should be placing another order. So 2 ways to work with the forecasting.
All right. No questions so far, so we'll keep going. We put together a slide with a few lessons learned in working with those demand forecasts. So what do you recommend, John?
Okay. Just from a mechanics of how to leverage the product is, or the forecasting is, we usually recommend a weekly forecast. Now, why would you want a weekly forecast? Well, the forecast is netted against actual demand. So if I had a forecast 100 for the month of June or May, let's say, and I have sales orders for 50, it's not going to plan 150 that I need. It's going to be 100. It's going to net against the forecast. So the forecast doesn't add on to the top of any demand, independent demand you have. And weekly forecast allows you to catch that. So let's say in the first week, you have you had a monthly schedule of 100 in the forecast. That first week, you had a customer order 150. Well, for the rest of the month, you'll have no demand from the forecast because it's already consumed. If you do that weekly, that 25 in the first week is absorbed by the 100 order, but then the next week you have that 25 again coming from the forecast that you may or may not order or build, but it's coming into the worksheet to give you a heads up based on your forecast. We should still be planning 25 this week. So that's why we usually recommend, or in most cases I've seen, a weekly forecast seems to work really well. You can also run forecast. Well, we're a proponent on best practices, set up locations. I think in the old days of some of the NAV implementations I've seen, there was no location. Well, the software's progressed where you really don't want to set it up that way anymore. So your forecast just be by location, and it allows you to say, here's the name of my forecast. It's for 2020. It's all electrical items is my forecast, for instance, and I would have location blue and then do my forecast. And when I run planning, it knows what location to pull in the planning for. So if I have multiple sites who had electrical components, I might have a blue forecast and a red. Maybe I'm East Coast, West Coast, and they could be different. And when I run my planning, I want to pull in the right forecast in order to understand what I might have to buy or need. And then I did talk about that netted. They're netted against the actual demand. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys, that if I have a forecast for 100 and sales orders for 50, it's not telling me to order 150. It's telling me to 100. 50 for independent demand and 50 for the forecast. And that would show up in the planning worksheet, and I still, as the buyer, planner, I still can determine if I'm going to do that or not. But I would be able to say, tell me to order 100. Oh, 50 are for real sales orders. Boy, I better do that. 50 are for the forecast. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to do that this time. I'm just going to do the 50. So you have that option to do those kind of things.
Okay, so how to create a demand forecast. One, the forecasts are static data. They don't update automatically. You have to manually update them. So you have to manually enter and update your forecasts in Nav or in Business Central. One thing that many have found useful is using RapidStart tools to import an Excel template into the forecast entry table. So if you have different calculations that you're using in Excel to try and calculate your forecast, you can then use RapidStart tools to import that into Nav or BC directly.
And I'll add a little bit to that is the static piece of that. Yes, it's static, much like the planning parameters are static. So when you start using, or if you are using BC, you know that, or Nav, that those fields are static. And whether it's the reorder point or reorder multiple, lead time, all those kind of things are static. And in your strategy, you really need to have how often do you want to update those? And then it comes down to what tools do we use to help us update those fields and then import them back in. And forecasting much the same way. Do you have a rolling forecast? For instance, at the end of May here, I calculate next May. You can do those kind of things much like a budget. A rolling budget is very similar too, where you have your budget for the month, and when May's over, I do May of 2021. Rather than turning it into a yearly big project, consider kind of a rolling updates. Just let me see. I have a few customers who are doing that, and I think that works pretty well.
All right. So let's look at a sales forecast and how that would be set up.
Okay. So here's a first look at a sales forecast. There's two types. There's a component and sales, and this is of sales. So you give it a name. It could be 2020 whatever, bicycle forecast or whatever. Location, as we recommend, fill in the location, and in the items below this are then by week is how we recommend. So week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. That's how it builds it. And this is populated with what we need on the finished items only. Probably that's what we focus on for the sales forecast. What do we think? And if you look at some of the data, where this one is pretty flat, but it looks like the first 3 weeks, every other week, we've got some increase or decrease, and that's all it is. So if you set this up to how you built the data, oftentimes we see if we do get forecasts from sales, we need to divide it by 4 because they won't do a weekly. If you're lucky to get a forecast, it's going to be a monthly forecast, and then you take that number and divide it by 4 to give you I'll call it a working forecast that helps address if you have a spike in 1 week that wipes out the whole month's forecast.
All right. All right, so let's look at a production forecast, so a component forecast. How would that be set up differently?
Yeah, in this one, again, the two uses I've seen for it are long lead time items, and maybe that's 90-day lead time, maybe even a 30 days a problem. But you can put a forecast out there, so like every, I don't know, every 6 weeks you have a demand. And then when you run your planning, you look forward 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and it will see that forecast and pull it into what it recommends for you to order. So that's a solid way to use that for long lead time items that are, you need a heads up well before a production or sales order might need it. And then the other is just where you have a repeatable item and it's every week you're ordering it, for instance, some fixed quantity, but the vendor changes. Sometimes you order it from a different vendor. So that would also pull into the planning worksheet. And that's where you would set it up in your reorder policy. That would probably be a lot for lot with a 6-day lot accumulation. So then you would see by week, oh yeah, in the next 4 weeks, I need 5,000, a PO for 5,000, a PO for 5,000. And that might be, this example, there was a constraint that they only had so much room to store it. So they couldn't order like 20,000 the first week of the month. That was not possible. So that they set it up that way, and that seemed to work pretty well. And again, you're still covered if your sales has a spike. That's going to explode your sales and say, on top of the 5,000 we need every week, we actually are going over that. And the planning worksheet would tell you, hey, you're up to 7,000 or something that you need in 2 weeks. So it consumes the forecast plus adds to it if it needs to. So 2 cases where I've seen that used well is repeatable purchased items that change vendors quite often, and then long lead time items for the component forecast. Again, not if it's your A and B type raw materials, that's a good use for it. Sometimes the C items, if you have too much of it, it's not a big deal, and you can just ramp up and bring in a bunch of it. And if it's laying around for an extra 3-4 weeks, it's not a big deal. But if it's an expensive item, raw material, you're trying to forecast it to reasonable. Done. From some of you that were on our customer conference, of interest, what's happening with this whole forecasting and whatnot is with the COVID-19 now, companies are finding that their supply chain is breaking. That the main speaker talked about that, and I think I agree with that. Is their supply chain is at risk. So does that mean you carry more inventory than you used to? It might be, because there was the just-in-time philosophy 20, 30 years ago that still kind of caught on, where you didn't have warehouses of raw material. But it'd be interesting to see where this progresses out of this COVID-19. If companies can carry more inventory, they may consider it for the longer lead time items or the some of the more expensive items. So that may change, and forecasting could help with that if you're just kind of doing a what if and those kind of things. So it's changing as we speak, I think, on the value of forecasting.
All right. Another thing to note is when you're doing forecasting, if you have to edit your forecast, NAV and Business Central have a feature that when you change your forecast number, if you drill down into the assist button, it'll actually track all of your changes to your forecast. So in this one, you can see I originally forecasted 20,000 pounds. We're upping it to 25,000 pounds. It creates an extra entry for that 5,000, and if you edit the list, it actually allows you to change that description and show why the change. Why are you increasing or decreasing the forecast? All right, no questions appeared during the presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
I do have one thing to add. Well, hopefully there's a few questions, but as a buyer, sometimes I'm interested in just saying, here's the what we think we're going to run next month, right? I mean, somebody, you know, they'll give you a list, and you can use BC to create what I call a like a planning bill of material, which said I'm going to make 115 blue, you know, bicycles this model, 108 of this one, 57 of this one, and you could use a forecast to do that at a, I'll call it a forecasting location where your on hand is zero. You have no inventory. So if you pulled in the forecast for June, let's say, I set up in the forecast 110 of this model, 50 of this, 70 of that, 50 of that, just a best guess. If I ran the forecast for a location, you know, a location where we don't really, it's just used for planning, it would total up all the components, all the sub-assemblies, everything, give you a picture of what kind of, maybe you're focusing on the A items. How many castings do I need to buy? Or how many, I don't know, A item or B item you need to buy? It could give you a quick look at, in June, I'm going to need 1,000 of these. And then you could go back to your normal data and look, you know, where does this fit in the puzzle? Because I don't have real orders yet. This is kind of what manufacturing or distribution is planning on selling next month. Where might I have some issues? So it's another way to use the forecast, but you'd assign it to a location, and in that location you have no inventory because you just want raw data based on what I'm forecasting. How many wheels am I going to need, for instance? Or in my example, how many spokes, or those kind of rough cut numbers that may help you in your planning. I've seen that used also. We had some customers do that because well, I want to look at, let's ignore inventory on everything. I just want to know what the total would be if we do actually run this production next month. And that could be on a smaller scale too. It could be, gee, I got a customer inquiring, let me just do a quick look of what we're going to need if this order comes through. You could do things like that also. Because you really wouldn't be creating purchase orders, but you want it to total up all the components that are similar and give you based on this next month that we're going to run this, we're going to need 700 or something, or 500. Different ways to use it that you may not have thought of.
All right, looks like one question came in here. If you're planning by location, does this mean that we need to be looking at SKUs instead of items?
It's a setup. You have to look at your setup. Now, there's a couple fields that in our best practices we would do. Location mandatory and the inventory setup. Location mandatory would be marked because, you know, again, it used to be that I'd see customers with blank location, and we no longer, that's not a best practice. But if that's location mandatory is checked, that forces a location on your sales order, on your purchase order, those kind of things, and you want that anyway. Because, and then if you're getting into planning, initially getting into planning, you would want the item record planning parameters to represent a location, by your main location, and you want then in the manufacturing setup to say components at location main. That means when I run planning, it's going to use the main item record for planning. And if you don't have multiple locations, you're all set. You've implemented locations, you want it. If you have a secondary location that does their own planning, then you would set up a SKU record, stock keeping unit for them, and fill in the parameters there. And any production items at that location on the SKU is components at location. So if I had a bicycle at a Phoenix location rather than Arizona, and Arizona was my main or whatever, I would have a SKU set up for that bicycle, for that location, and when I run my planning, I want the components to also be planned at that SKU location. So it's not complicated. You just have to make sure you've got it set up correctly, and it works fine. And the answer, do you need a SKU? No. You can, but the way it's set up, you want to make sure that the item record represents your main location. I've been in companies where they run planning, they set up a SKU for every item. You don't need to do that. That's not necessary. So hopefully, I don't know, maybe that was an old way of doing things, but you don't need to do that. Hopefully that answers your question. And we can help you with that if you follow up question, we can point that out to you. It's not complicated, it's just a setup thing.
All right, he said it does. Okay. All right, if you have any more questions or want to learn more, you can contact John. Here's his contact information, our resident manufacturing guru.
The old guy.
And then finally, we do have 2 more coming up in our webinar series on manufacturing. The next one is on June 10th, and we'll be going through planning worksheet, tips, tricks, and best practices. We will be in July adding a few more sessions to our series as well. So you'll have to wait for those titles to come out. And I will hand it back to Keith.
All right, thank you, Jenny and John, for presenting today. And whether you're joining us live or on demand, we thank you for joining us as well. We do have several more webinars coming up that we hope that you'll be able to join us for. Next Tuesday, June the 2nd, we have Holly Cuddle from Innovia Consulting. She'll be presenting on pivot tables, not as difficult as they seem, at 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern. And then next Thursday, June 4th, we'll have Mark Hamblin from InsightWorks. He'll be presenting on manufacturing and distribution add-ons for Business Central at 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern. And then, of course, you can always check our website for more of our upcoming events. That's innovia.com/events. And just a reminder as well that we have a podcast going. So if you haven't listened to it already, it's called the Innovia Conversation. We want to encourage you to check it out on your favorite podcast platform. Steve and Jeff have been going for about a year now, and they do about 2 episodes per month. You can find all about all the different platforms that we have it on at the podcast page at innovia.com/podcast. So you can go on there and go to the platform of your choice and subscribe so you'll get notified when our new episodes air. And I think that is it. So thank you again for joining us, everyone. We look forward to seeing you on another Innovia webinar. Have a great day.